Welcome to Mortality with Meep. I'm going to do a mortality update for the United States, just looking at total mortality, all causes today, because I have a message for all y'all. Winter is coming. So I'm at the CDC Excess Mortality Dashboard. I'll drop a link in the video description. And we're starting at the top level. This is the default view when you go to the link. The entire United States, going back to January 2017 up until first week of September, but that last week and actually the last couple weeks are probably an undercount of deaths. So what do we see? For those who are new here, there was a bad flu year in this particular 2017-2018 flu season. You may have forgotten that. That's okay. When we have bad flu years, often you don't hear about it, frankly. It's mainly older people who die. So we still have our pandemic. This graph, the blue, each blue column is 1 week's worth of deaths by when they occurred, not when they were reported, because you may be looking at this, especially the 2020 and the 2021 numbers, you're like, oh, that's not what it looked like when I looked at, when you look at these other dashboards, it's by when they reported the death, not when it actually occurred. I don't care about when it was reported. When it occurred really tells us what was going on. The yellow line is a threshold, and you can see because these blue bars are below the yellow line for the prior years, for most years, this has to do not with the expected level of deaths, but once you go over a certain confidence interval, I think a 95th percentile with various assumptions, then it's considered excess mortality. And they've been using this kind of definition in FluView, the weekly report coming out of the CDC every year, every week for each flu season, and I had been watching that for years. When it goes through that threshold, then that's definitely excess mortality. Of course, you can have excess mortality at a level far below that, but each little red plus is excess mortality. Great. So what have we seen over the last year and a half? We had 3 waves, and actually I should say 4 waves of COVID deaths, essentially, but every single week, starting at the end of March 2020, and I would actually argue it started a little bit before then as well, but we could really tell that last week in March, we've had excess mortality every single week for the entire United States, and that's what the little red pluses on every single column past that week indicate. We had a spring 2020 wave of deaths that was centered around New York and New York City. And I'll show you this in a moment. I'm going to hit the most populous states' locations, and it captures kind of some of the geographical spread of these waves. Then there was a summer 2020 wave, and you can see about like beginning of August, end of July is when it peaked. Then there was a winter wave. It got started, and you can kind of see it never really all the way went down, but we had a wave of deaths, went to an even higher peak than the prior ones before at the beginning of January of 2021. And then that really came down, and we've had a summer 2021 wave. So where exactly are these waves going on? And that's why am I saying winter is coming? I want you to look at this big old wave. So that's the United States. Let's start with our most populous state, which is California. So, now, of course, the vertical scale will change for each of these states based on, what their baseline is, what their max is. So you can see there was some excess mortality, and this is a problem we're going to have with these most populous states, of course, except for, I'm just kind of looking on here. Illinois is not geographically that big, and Florida actually does not really have a lot of geographic variation. But California and Texas, not only are they very populous, but they are huge geographically. Now, Texas stretches across the south, and California is more of a north-south. So what can happen, and I'm just using the CDC dashboard here, is that we do kind of see a little bitty amount of excess mortality in the spring of 2020. And there definitely was a summer wave, but where we really saw the big hit in excess mortality was that winter wave. And pretty much every state that missed big run-ups in that spring and summer wave absolutely had a winter wave. It hit everywhere. The magnitude of that winter wave of excess deaths differed, partly based on how hard it was hit early on. So they really didn't have a lot of excess mortality percentage-wise until they got to that winter wave. We do see a little bit of the summer 2021 wave in California, but I would not be surprised they get hit with another winter wave. We will move on to our next state, which is Texas. And this one is interesting. I think they're all interesting, of course. So Texas had that summer wave. Okay, hardly surprising. It's along the south. And what we did see geographically is the summer 2020 wave was generally across the south of the U.S. And we see that, Texas again was hit, it looks like, a summer wave. Fine. Okay, but they also had a winter wave. It was a little higher. It was not as an extreme difference between these waves. Notice, it has come down a little bit, but, these data are a little premature. There is a lag, and I'm not going to break out how much of this is predicted deaths and how much is already reported deaths. That's not really that important at this point. For the largest states, generally the data have been good coming into the CDC. Yes, there is a lag. There's always a lag. It takes a while for the death certificates to get issued and then reported to the CDC. That's where all of these numbers come from. It's coming from actual death certificates based on when the death occurred. Yes, the CDC does its own estimate of unreported deaths, but my experience has been this last year they've underestimated unreported deaths during the pandemic. Okay, that was Texas. Next in line is Florida. So let's take a look. Florida got hit by that summer wave. They also got hit by the winter wave, but it was at, about the same height, a little less sparse. I'm just eyeballing it here. But, kind of same order of magnitude as that summer 2020 wave. Well, summer 2021 is a worse wave in Florida in terms of excess deaths. In a future video, I'll look at how these deaths break out by age and by race. Those will be separate videos. But I want you to look at this. So we had Florida and then Texas. Let's go back to Texas. These are our two southern states in this sample. And the thing is, with the Texas one, it may be that it's too soon to tell for their summer wave, but the Florida wave, summer wave, definitely worse than it was last summer. But this might not be something special to Florida. I want you to think right now ahead of time. If you're going to make a prediction, I don't want you to go into the future and then when there's the winter wave, and there will be a winter wave, let's suppose it is as bad as what we're seeing in Florida, which would not surprise me in the least. You should be prepared, okay? Did you hear that the winter 2021, winter 2020 to 2021 wave was worse than the prior waves of COVID deaths? Did you hear that? Maybe you did. I didn't notice it, but that's partly because I'm in New York. So let's look at New York State. And that's why kind of our local biases can really change things. The problem is I live in New York State and I live pretty close to New York City. I'm in Westchester County, which has gotten hit bad in the past. So this is New York State minus New York City. We'll look at New York City in a moment. They got hit very hard, very quickly in that spring 2020 wave. And then it came down. It was silent during the summer of 2020, and then we got a winter wave, but it wasn't as acute. It was more spread out. If I actually count up the excess deaths, the area under those curves, which would be the excess deaths, are actually probably about the same. It was just spread out over a longer period of time. It doesn't go to as high a peak and it comes down. We have had a little bit of excess mortality in the summer of 2021. But as I say, I am expecting a winter wave in New York State. But because we got so hit so hard, it may be our winter wave won't be as bad as what will happen in other states. Let me do New York City. New York City was, someone asked me, why don't they just combine New York State and New York City and blah, blah, blah. Well, they could have, but I want you to look at this spike from a relative point of view. If I added the New York City deaths, so that spiked near 8,000. If I go back to New York State, this spike was definitely a lot less. Yeah, if we added New York City to New York, yeah, the whole state would look bad, and I'll do an analysis with that. That's okay. But from a percentage standpoint, I mean, this is way out of scale for New York City. And so what you see for New York City is, yeah, they got hit really bad in spring 2020. And the winter wave, you're like, what is that? But from a percentage standpoint, it might not be that different from the winter wave elsewhere. It's hard to tell. So maybe, yeah, I'll combine those two in my own analysis coming later. But yeah, New York was hit pretty bad. There's a little bit of activity in New York City in the summer. And maybe there'll just be another mild wave in the winter relatively, but you'll see it's spread out over a long period. This is definitely not the same number of deaths in that first wave, and then the second wave, which is part of the third wave for the whole country. Okay, that's New York. Let's do Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania is not really Midwest, but it's not really East Coast. It kind of stretches far. So what did they get hit with? They did get hit. There's a little bit of a delay, but they did get hit with the spring 2020 wave. Philadelphia, obviously, I mean, a very densely populated portion of Pennsylvania is close to New Jersey and, of course, New York City. So that first spring 2020 wave kind of came out from New York City, in the kind of the whole Amtrak corridor there. So in the Northeast, so they got that. A little bit of activity in the summer, but not a huge amount. And they got hit by the winter wave. The Midwest got hit really bad by the winter wave of COVID. And again, I am expecting this to happen again for the winter 2021 into 2022. Okay, so that's Penn. And then finally, I'm going to do Illinois. And that'll be my last state, because Illinois definitely is in the Midwest. And of course, it does have the major city of Chicago. Yeah, it'd be nice to split Chicago off for the rest of the state, but I'm not doing that here. Chicago, you're just not populous enough. The only other city I would attempt to do an analysis for would be Los Angeles, because, of course, Los Angeles County is the largest county by population in the entire United States, and we do actually have death counts at the county level. That makes it easy. I could do Cook County for Illinois, the county in which Chicago's in, but yeah, it's county level. Maybe if I got into a more detailed analysis, I think a gross level analysis. If we want to predict what's going to happen this coming winter, looking at what's happened in the major population areas by state is just fine. So Illinois. They got that spring wave. It came down a little more slowly than in some of the other places, and then they got hit by the winter wave. They've had some extra activity in the summer, but again, I'm expecting, Florida has gotten hit really badly, and I assume this is Delta or whatever other variants are circulating, Mu, whatever. We were making jokes about a Vega variant, etc. The issue here, and you'll notice I never said anything about vaccination. Well, vaccination is for another video, another time, but the vaccination may reduce risk for individuals, but if you have a wave coming through that's even more virulent, and for a certain subpopulation, and it could be 80% of the population, that this subpopulation has a reduced risk, relative risk of 90%. So great for the individuals who are vaccinated. That said, that doesn't mean their risk is reduced to zero. Okay, it's just 90% reduction is really good. Even 50% reduction would be great. A lot of the interventions that we see government attempting to impose, unfortunately, are a lot less effective than 50% and 90%. My point, though, is this. To the extent, we still have risk. We still have, and as I said, I'll look at the age breakout next. I think that will be a good one to look at next. Because who is dying? You'll see there have been some shifts, and partly that's due to changes, differences in vaccination rates. The oldest people are more vaccinated than the youngest adults, okay? Which, is what one would expect, not only by how people behave, but also because who had access to vaccines earlier. It was first the oldest people and then younger and younger groups in general. So we're going to be seeing, this is not really much of a prediction. Winter is coming. I think there's going to be another wave up here in the north, in the Midwest, etc., just like we had last winter, because what has changed, we have treatments that we know are effective. We have vaccines, again, like 80 to 90% effective. They cut risk. Fine. Doesn't cut it to zero. And if you have additional waves coming through that are still virulent, the issue with coronaviruses, evidently, it's just like the flu. You never get rid of it. The question is, can you make it less deadly? So let me just go back to the United States as a whole. Flu is deadly. It kills, and this is only going back to 2017. They pushed it back this far so you could see one bad flu year. What does one bad flu year look like? COVID, guys, is much, much worse. But yeah, so that was actually a really bad flu year, and that's what that looks like. It's a spike around winter. Well, we're seeing spikes in the summer, but it's in places where people are inside an AC and breathing each other's air. Why New York City? Well, in that first wave, of course, it's the mass transit, it's the subways and trains, people sitting next to each other, breathing each other's air, and of course, all the international flights. So you have a huge concentration of people in one place, a lot of dense living, and of course, a lot of people moving around via subway, and it was the subway moving it around in New York City. And then that's also the trains, how it got into New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Connecticut and yada yada. Anyway, this is the message coming out from this review of what we've got. State of play for mortality right now is winter is coming. Expect increased problems, just like we had last year. There was a run up, and again, when we go by when the deaths occurred, not when they were reported, but when they occurred, you see a pretty smooth curve here, that it was growing through the fall, peaked at the beginning of January, and came back down. And that's what the flu waves actually generally look like. COVID just may become, once, it gets to a reasonable, I'm sorry to say, through vaccination and through people actually getting the disease, we could say herd immunity, but it's once we get it so that we've acclimated essentially to this particular disease, it may just become part of the seasonal mix, along with flu, that we just have to deal with it every year. And it seems that unlike the flu, so this flu pneumonia, that perhaps there will be a summer component for places that just don't filter their air well enough, or they're just pushing air around with AC. My understanding is there are ventilation systems that can improve the situation, but that's not, that's not my area of expertise. My area of expertise is looking at these patterns and going like, well, yeah, there is a summer wave this year as well as last year, even after vaccine take up. And I'm fully expecting there to be a winter wave of COVID deaths. So that's all. Next time, I'll look at the spread, the breakout by age.